So today's seminar is going to be creating a budget and start building for the future. So it's just about creating a budget and then starting a savings plan. Um, so what we're going to do is, let me just proceed here. Now, this kind of explains what we're going to be covering during this series. It's kind of a financial wellness series. And so the first one is this creating a budget, figuring out some essential savings. So how do I start building a savings account when I have all these demands for my money? And then once we talk about establishing the budget and a savings plan, the next one, in fact, it's next week, we're going to be talking about managing your debt. So we'll talk about different types of debt, what you should prioritize on with your debt. And then also we'll talk about kind of managing and boosting your credit score, because that can impact future interest rates when you're buying a home, things like that. They do look at your credit score. So I think that's important to recognize. So we'll be covering that next week. Okay, so why a budget? I think a lot of people think that a budget is a little bit of a dirty word. So they think it's restrictive and, it tells me how much I can or can't control, or how much I can or can't spend and how much control I have over it. Like I lose control because I have this budget that I have to stick to. But really, the purpose of the budget is to help, I think, stabilize your income stream and your plan and your finances and provide you with some income and some freedom. So really, the first step to it is to covering your essential expenses. Like that's kind of the primary goal of the budget, is to make sure you can pay all your bills. And then the secondary things that come after that are, making sure that you're ready for unplanned expenses. I find that a lot of people who don't have a budget and maybe don't have an emergency fund, their plan for the unplanned expenses or lack of plan is basically just use a credit card. So something comes up, and if you don't have an emergency fund, they just put the money on a credit card, and then the emergency is over with, and now you're neck deep in credit card debt, and you're trying to stay above water, fighting out of that credit card debt because you had that emergency. So really, we want to be able to meet that, and then also beyond that, just plan some additional goals that you might have. So some of the more discretionary things. So we'll talk about how to accomplish some of that. So first, let's talk about creating a budget and what goes into it. Hopefully, at the end of today, you will leave with a good idea of that, of how to create a budget and what to do. And Anna, just so you know, I don't see the chat box on mine. So if there are questions that come up, you might have to chime in and just let me know the questions, then I can answer those questions as we go.
Totally sounds good.
Thanks. Okay, so 3 essential components to a budget. First is essential spending. So we're going to go into that in more detail, but making sure that you're paying the bills that you need to pay. Then we have essential savings. Big one here is retirement savings. That's pretty essential, but also things like emergency funds. So we'll dive into that. How much should you do in essential spending? Like how much of your income should go to essential spending? We'll talk about that. And then lastly, other wants and goals. So this is really all a budget is. Like it doesn't have to be very complicated. I think a lot of times when you think about a budget, it can be overwhelming because you have so many bills and so many places where money is going. And you might even have multiple places where money comes from. And so it seems maybe a little bit overwhelming to think about building this. But if you just boil it down to this, what are my essential expenses? How about my essential saving? Is that being met? And then what are the other things that I want to do? And that's probably where you'll spend a lot more time after you've actually built your budget, is figuring out some of the other goals and wants. So what is essential spending? Essential spending is what you have to spend every month. I think of this as, well, let me back up. I do these seminars a lot, and I was asking people, give me some examples of essential spending. And I had someone say, wine. So they felt like, wine was part of their essential spending budget. But I had to clarify and say, I feel like essential spending is what people spend their money on who live at or below the poverty line. So those who have very little and they have no extra money, what do they have to spend money on? They have to spend money on housing, food, healthcare, getting to and from work and or school, childcare maybe, and that might be a huge one. I've heard that sometimes people have two kids in daycare, and the daycare cost exceeds their mortgage. So that's a huge expense. Minimum debt payments and then other financial obligations. And this, look at this, it says 50% or less of your take home pay. Some of you may have heard there's a 40% debt to income ratio rule of thumb with buying a house. And I would say that's the absolute maximum I would recommend that you do. So 40% of your take home pay toward your mortgage, because that's a big expense. If you're getting above that up to the 50%, that's not going to leave very much for the other things that we'll talk about in a second here. Um, but 50% of your take home pay, that would allow you, again, this is spending. So then what about the other 50%? Well, that's where essential savings, some of the other essential stuff, and then the more discretionary stuff comes in. Now, I also recognize that in Seattle, this might be hard to do. So if you are buying a house, it's very likely that your mortgage will alone be 50% of your take home pay. I call that being house poor, because it probably means you don't have a lot of extra money to spend elsewhere. And sometimes you kind of have to stretch to get into a house. I can tell you that when we bought our house years ago, it was a stretch, and we were at the high end of our debt to income ratio just buying the house. But we knew that, we already had our budget in place, so we knew where other money had to go. It really did cut into our discretionary spending, and we knew that over time our mortgage was going to stay fairly constant, right? Because you generally have a fixed mortgage, and so it's going to stay fairly constant. It might go up a little bit because of taxes. And I know taxes seem like they're huge, but as far as your total house payment, they're a smaller portion of the total house payment. So even if taxes went up 10%, the effect on your total house payment is fairly minimal because it's a smaller portion of the house payment. So then after time, as our mortgage stayed constant, our mortgage is here and our income kept going up. So we were making more, and then it became more and more comfortable. So sometimes it is a stretch to get into that house initially, and then you'll find that you can get some more wiggle room as you have promotions or just cost of living increases, things like that. Essential savings. So this is really saving for retirement, creating an emergency fund, and then saving for unplanned expenses. So the recommendation is that you save 15% of your pre-tax income toward retirement savings. Now, the good news is at UW has some great retirement plans. So they're also contributing to your retirement. If you are in the UWRP, if you're younger than 35, you're putting in 5, UW is putting in 5, so already you're at 10%. So that might mean that you have to bump it up to another 5% in the VIP or in an IRA for you to get to 15%. And then when you hit age 35, that UWRP goes to 7.5% with a 7.5% match. Boom, you're at 15%. PERS employees, if you're PERS 2, you're putting in 8%. And I want to say that UW's contribution is around 11 or 12%. So it's quite a bit what they put into the PERS system. If you're in PERS 3, then you had to choose your contribution rate. And if you chose a lower rate, if you elected for a 5% static rate, then that will allow you to save a little bit more going forward to get to that total of 15%. Again, I think UW puts in close to 11%. So even with that one, you're pretty close to the 15% all in. If you have a spouse or partner who doesn't work for UW, chances are pretty good they're not going to have a retirement plan as good as yours. So, you might sit down with them and talk about, hey, are you saving 15% toward retirement with your employer match? A common match is 3%. So if your spouse or partner only receives 3% from the employer, they should target a 12% savings rate. If you can't do this initially, a lot of plans allow for an automatic increase program. So you put the money in and you can just have it step up automatically every year, 1%. If you don't have that, you go in manually and increase it 1%. Because I know that sometimes if I sit down with someone and I say, hey, you need to be saving 15% toward retirement, and they only get a 3% match, if they're not doing anything, to go from 0 to 12, that might be kind of difficult. But you can just do 1% per year and have that grow over time. I'll never forget a meeting I had with a woman who she was in her late 50s, and she came in, and it was at a hospital, and she said, Doug, I'm so sorry. I haven't looked at this stuff in 15 years. And she was all apologetic and, saying she hadn't looked at her retirement at all in 15 years. And she said, I've been taking care of my aging mother, and I work, 60 hours a week, and I'm a single mother. And so, she really didn't have time to look at it. And I said, so do you have any idea how much you have in retirement? And she said, I have no idea. And I pulled up her account, and she was actually saving 18% of her pay on her own, not including the employer piece. She was saving 18%. And I said, so do you have any clue how much you have? And she said, no, I have no idea. And I said, well, you have about $350,000. And she started crying, and she was so happy. And I just said, well, how did you not know you were saving nearly a fifth of your paycheck? And what it was is she had signed up for these annual increases years ago where it just automatically was increasing 1%, and she never missed it. So if a plan offers that, unfortunately, the UWRP and VIP, you can't change those automatically, but you can set a little reminder for yourself to go in and change it. So once you've done your essential savings, then you have room for other wants and goals. So that might be building a better retirement, might be more discretionary things like travel, or buying a new car, upgrading your house, paying for kids' education. This is an important one. So I have met people who have really prioritized their paying for their kids' education, and I commend that. However, just be careful, because you can pay for your kids' education at the expense of your own retirement. And I've seen people do that where they spent so much money on their kids' education that when it came time for them to retire, they didn't have enough because they weren't doing the required amount to be where they should be for retirement. And I was like, boy, I hope your kids are grateful, because you're going to be working until you're 80, So just be aware of that, and talk to your kids about the impact of college debt. So, I have kids. In fact, I have two in college right now, and I had the conversations with them to say, look, depending on where you do your undergrad, you can either graduate with $150,000 in debt, or if you choose a cheaper school or you get scholarships, you might be able to graduate with no debt. And so just having those kind of conversations. And lastly, just paying off big debts. So once you have your essential stuff taken care of, you pay off big debts next. What's interesting about this is I think sometimes having a lot of debt can be confusing, because it's this burden that's kind of weighing you down. And so all you want to do is put your extra money toward this big debt before addressing your essential expenses. But inevitably what happens is you just can never get ahead. Like I've had people that get so excited to like pay off big debt that they don't pay attention to their regular expenses, and they end up putting more on the credit cards because they didn't have enough left over to pay their other bills. So while they're digging out of the hole, they're shoveling back into that hole. So it's you have to be careful and just make sure you have it set up first. Okay, let's look at an example. In fact, we're going to look at two examples here. First one is Heather. Heather makes $60,000 a year. Pre-tax, that's $5,000. Her take-home pay is about $4,000. We'll call it $4,100 a month. So if we look at her spending, these are some of her bills. I guess I would like to know how she only pays $70 a month for utilities, and where on earth does she get groceries for 180, unless she's eating like my son at college, lots of ramen and things like that. But she's basically at 44% of her take-home pay for her spending. So she's under that kind of recommended 50% amount. So that's good. She is saving 9% toward retirement. So if she doesn't have an employer match, she's a little underfunded there, but not bad. If she bumped that up to 10%, I would say, Heather, you're doing a pretty good job with your retirement savings. The big thing for Heather though, she doesn't have an emergency savings and she's not putting any money toward that. So even though she might tell me, yeah, I have other things I want to do. I want to eat out. I want to shop. I want to save for a house. It's a big one. I want to buy a house. I have a gym membership. I want to travel. Before any of that, I would say you need to build an emergency fund because Heather is one emergency away from having a whole bunch of credit card debt. So we didn't even see, she's making small credit card payments of 40 bucks. So she doesn't have a really big balance. But if she had a big emergency, that could balloon up to $200, $300, $400, which would put her over the 50% for essential spending. So she needs an emergency fund. Bill here makes $90,000 a year, pre-tax $7,500. His take home is $6,000 a month. Here are his expenses. Pretty low mortgage. I'm guessing he bought that house a long time ago, or he doesn't live in Seattle, right? And we can see that he's spending 54% of his take home on essential spending. But the big cause of that is his daughter's tuition. So that won't happen forever. He's having to tighten the belt a little bit right now while he pays for his daughter's tuition. But he's doing a good job otherwise because he's putting 8% in retirement. So if he gets an employer match, he's probably pretty on track. And he's saving 5%, so $300 toward an emergency fund. Awesome. The great thing about an emergency fund is once you've built it up, so if Bill already had his 6 months of expenses in an emergency fund, so that's, we'll talk about that in just a second, but that would be, big chunk of money. So if his expenses are $3,000 a month or $3,200, 6 times that amount is what he would need for his emergency fund. And that's a pretty big number. So if he already had that though, then I could say, okay, you're done. You've built your emergency fund. You don't need to keep funding it if you already have 6 months built up. So maybe take that 5%, put a little bit of it toward retirement, and maybe spend some of it on other things that you want to do. All right, let's talk about creating a budget. So there is a spending and savings checkup. Let me do another share with you here. Right here. We'll see if we can get these links to Anna. Wait, I don't think that's shared. Let me try that one more time. There we go. Okay, so this spending and savings checkup is just a really high level. What's your annual household income? 65,000. Are you married? No. So it just takes you kind of through these things. How much you're spending on housing, groceries, healthcare, transportation, no kids, no debt. So total monthly expenses are $29.50. What percent are you putting away for retirement? I'm putting 10% in. Have my 5% in the UWRP, and I'm putting 5% in the VIP. Let's talk about short-term savings. Do you have an emergency fund? No, I don't really have that. And I don't save a lot. I put $25 a month toward other expenses. So we can type in a 25 there. And then it's just going to give you kind of a summary of how you're doing. So this person's essential expenses are pretty high. Probably need to dial that back somehow. So that might mean that they're house poor. So not a lot of extra money to do other things. Anyway, that's just kind of a quick and dirty in terms of figuring out your plan. Let's go back to the seminar here. But 50, 15, and 5 is kind of the rule of thumb. 50% essential savings, 15% pre-tax toward retirement, 5% towards short-term savings. So building that emergency fund, 5% of your pay should go toward that. Whoops. That link took me. I didn't realize that was a link. So how do you start this whole thing? So how do you estimate your future spending? The first thing you really need to do before you start anything is you have to figure out where your money is going right now. So you have to track your spending. There are several apps that will help with this. Probably the most common that I've heard of, that most people have heard, that are familiar with, is called Mint. And I'll tell you that I'm not a huge fan of Mint. And the reason is it's fairly automated. I've used it before. It's fairly automated. It categorizes things automatically. You can change some categories, but it wasn't as customizable as I'd hoped. And the biggest thing about it that I didn't like, it was just totally automatic. So it was too easy to forget about it. So if you have an iPhone, there is an app called Spending Tracker. So that's simply that. Spending Tracker is the app on the iPhone. And if you have an Android, the app is called Andro Money. So Andro Money is the app on Android. Both these apps are free. And really all you're doing is you're just plugging in your expenses for a month. There's another one called I Need a Budget. But basically, right now, we're not talking about building the whole budget. All we're talking about is figuring out where your money's going. So my wife and I did this several years ago. We were sitting around the dinner table, and our kids were asking questions like, how much is a mortgage? And how much is, oh, you know what? Actually, I can see the chat. It just showed up for me. Yeah, so these tools will be available to share. So let's see. Yep. Okay. So Anna's answering some of those. So I'll keep going. Anyway, the kids were asking, where's the money go, and how much is our budget? Is how much are these payments, and how much is our house payment, and how much we spend on food per month, and how much is our heating bill, and for garbage, and all these things, and as we're adding it up, we kind of looked at each other and we were like, where's the rest of our money going? And I should be ashamed to say this as a financial advisor, but it happens to everybody. And we don't have a super strict budget. So we have kind of a savings-based budget, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit. But basically what we did is we tracked it for a month. So we both downloaded the app to our phones, and every single time we spent money, we just pulled out the phone and said, okay, that was $35 for groceries. I just paid $48 for gas. Like every single time we spent money for an entire month, we tracked where the money went and we placed it in a category. And you could even create custom categories. So what I wouldn't do is I wouldn't say food as one category that includes eating out and dining, eating at home. So groceries. I would create two separate categories. I would create eating out, and then I would create a shopping, like a food budget for groceries, because at the end of that period, we looked at our dining out budget and it was way higher than we had figured. And what it was is, we were both working. We have 4 kids. It was when all 4 kids were at home. So, a couple nights a week, it was like, you know what, I don't feel like cooking. She didn't feel like cooking. So we'd go out to eat, and, it seemed like it was $100 every time. So we had this, ridiculously high monthly expense for eating out. So what we were able to do is the next month we just said, okay, let's not eat out even once. Let's not eat out at all. Let's try just never going out. We're going to plan every single meal and eat at home. And we did it. And it was amazing that we did have a lot of money left over. I mean, we were paying our bills otherwise, and we were doing our savings and doing all the stuff we should. But, this was a way to say, is this really where we want our extra money going? Is if we're going to have like a discretionary spending account to improve our lifestyle, do we really want to do that eating out? Or are there other things we'd rather do with that money? Yeah, there were other things we wanted to do with that money. So track your expending, track your expenses, do it for 1 month, maybe 2 months, and then go back and review it. Then you can estimate your future spending. So you can figure out, okay, these are our essential expenses. This is where money has to go. So we know we're going to spend $2,800 a month or $3,800 a month or whatever it is. So once you know that amount, now you know what to do with the discretionary stuff. Where does the extra go? And so that's where you can say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be going to Starbucks every day, both of us. Let's just brew at home and save $10 a morning, from going to Starbucks. And then once you've done that, make savings automatic. My suggestion is set up a separate account somewhere other than where you do your normal banking. So I do my banking through Chase. And what I did is I went to a separate credit union and I set up an account where I didn't have check writing, I didn't have a debit card, I didn't have bill pay. I mean, I could go in and access the money if I needed to, but I didn't have easy ways to get to the money. And what I did is I set up direct deposit into that other account. So it was kind of out of sight, out of mind, separate from our checking account, and just kept it going. So I actually started this. I started at Fidelity over 20 years ago. And when I first got hired, I started one of these accounts, 25 bucks a paycheck. That's all it was. I figured, you know what? I could do 25 bucks a paycheck and wouldn't really feel that. And so what is your amount that you could do that you wouldn't really miss? If it's 20 bucks a month, 20 bucks a paycheck, whatever it is, just do that and put that in a separate account. And wasn't growing real fast at first, but then after a couple of raises and promotions and things like that, I increased it, went to 50 bucks a paycheck. And now after 20 years, that's a pretty good account that we could use in an emergency or something very unexpected, or really anything we want to use it for. So, make that savings automatic. And then once you've built it up enough, then you can stop. So this kind of goes over that again. Open a separate account, save as much as you can afford, make regular deposits every day. Don't touch it, just let it grow. And only use it for emergencies. What's an emergency? Okay, this is where I'm going to kind of go off script just a little bit, because I think there should be two separate accounts. I think you should have an emergency fund and an unexpected expense fund. Okay, here's why. An emergency fund, like I said before, is something that you can just build and build until you have 6 months worth of expenses. Chances are not good, knock on wood, that you will need that emergency fund. It's not common to have a true emergency. A true emergency would be you got in an accident and you can't work for 9 months. You have 6 months before your long-term disability payment kicks in. So you have no money coming in for 6 months. You have to pay the bills. You have to pay the mortgage. You have to do whatever. That's an emergency. Several years ago, we got a leak in our roof, and it was unexpected. It was during a big storm, and drip, drip, drip in the front room. And while it was very unexpected, I wouldn't really classify that as an emergency yet, because honestly, I could have gotten up on the roof and I could have put a big blue tarp up there, or maybe two of them, right? And made it through winter. Or made it into summer and then delay it and try to build up enough funds to pay for that. So that was an unexpected expense. And so we had this separate budget in an unexpected expense fund that we pulled out of. So we didn't touch the emergency money, that just stayed put. The emergency money we pulled out of, or the unexpected expense fund we pulled out of, and really drew it down. So then after we fixed the roof, we funded that again to bring it back up. So you might have enough unexpected expenses that you're constantly putting money into it, because just things come up. Like that happens all the time. There might be a death, you have to buy a plane ticket and go to a funeral. Might be a wedding that you have to buy a plane ticket for and go to that. Car repairs, home repairs, any number of things that are unexpected. Furlough might be something that's unexpected, that's not quite an emergency until you run out of your emergency fund. Then it's a real emergency. I just had a thought on that. Oh, I get a big question often about what to do with your emergency fund. I've been saying here, that can be quite a bit of money if we're talking about 6 months of living expenses. So where do you put that? Where do you hold it? I think I have a Washington State Employees Credit Union account. I want to say in my account there, I'm getting 0.02%, something like that. It's a terrible rate. There are some banks that pay a little bit higher. I know there are some online banks. Ally Bank is one of them. I think last I heard they were paying about 0.5%. What you have to understand is there's something called the risk-free rate. The risk-free rate is the rate that you earn on money that is totally liquid and you're not taking any risk with it. So you can pull it out whenever you want, and there's no risk of loss. Right now, that rate is 0. That happened back during COVID. When COVID started back in March, the Fed dropped the Fed funds rate to 0. So overnight, money markets, prior to that, we had a money market at Fidelity that was yielding 2.5%. So great place to hold your cash. Overnight, those yields dropped. I think we're at 0.02% now. So rates are low across the board. It is what it is. The most important thing with your emergency fund is that you can access it when you need it and that it won't go down in value. As long as you're meeting those two things, I wouldn't get concerned about the yield you're earning in your emergency fund. It's more important that it's there. You earn yield in other investments like your retirement. So the question posed here, how can I afford retirement? I guess I would ask, how can I not afford retirement? You can't afford not to save for retirement. The good thing about UW is you have to do retirement savings. So this is kind of done for you. But there's some additional that you could do where you benefit from compounding. So this would be saving in the VIP or maybe an IRA. So you're reinvesting money from an initial investment when it generates earnings. So you invest $100 and the market goes up. So last year, the market earned about 18%. So if you had it invested in the market, your $100 now grows to 118. So now that extra $18 that you have in there is compounding again. So market has been up so far this year. We'll see what happens right now during all this GameStop debacle. But if the market ends up this year, then that $18 that you were in last year will also grow. And so that compounding effect really starts to come into play after you've been doing it for a while. So the longer the money stays in, the harder each dollar works for you. Let me do another share for you here. There is a power of small amounts. Let's see here. Yep, so I see comments there from Anna talking about CIT Bank, talking about money markets rates. So thanks for that, Anna. And if anybody else has some ideas, feel free to post those to the chat section so everyone can see it, because there are some good ideas out there. Okay, let me do another share. So there's also this power of small amounts right here. Okay, so let's see how a small change can make a big difference. So sometimes you think, I'm doing 15% toward retirement. Would 1% more really make that big of a difference? Yeah, it can, especially if you're young. So this example, Rachel, 30 years old, makes $60,000 a year and wants to have more money for traveling. So what if Rachel saved an additional 1%? That might equate to $125,000 in retirement, just 1%. Now that is for 37 years, because the assumption is that she'll retire at 67. So that's 37 years at 1%, also assuming some wage growth at about 1.5% wage growth. So, this is real. So don't get discouraged if you don't have savings. Just start now and start putting money in, because that can, it'll really add up over time and make a big difference. So use that calculator and, determine, what if I were to save 3% or 5%? And it'll kind of show you the benefit of, additional savings. How are we on time? Yeah, we're doing really well on time. So getting started with your budget, number one, plan for essential expenses. That's the very first thing you do. So before you try to limit your spending with a budget, figure out how much you're going to need to cover your essential expenses. Then cover essential spending. Lastly, use what's left over for the other things, for all the extra stuff. So this would be discretionary spending. That might be saving more for retirement or paying down debt. There used to be a slide that talked about, hopefully I've touched on this enough, but what if you want to build a budget, but you have a bunch of credit card debt at 18%? Shouldn't you pay extra on that credit card debt before you build an emergency fund? No, you shouldn't. you should build the emergency fund first. So interestingly, Fidelity prioritizes the emergency fund before any other savings, before retirement savings, before paying down high interest debt, before saving for a house, before any of that. Build an emergency fund, because that is the only thing that's keeping you from being neck deep in credit card debt if you have an emergency. Can't tell you how many people I've met with over the years who didn't have emergency funds. Then they had emergencies and they put it on credit cards, and I was meeting with them years after the fact, and they were still paying off those credit cards and not making much headway because of the interest rate they were paying. There's also a little viewpoint shared by Fidelity I'd like to show you. So I'll share this with Anna as well. I'll send Anna all these links so she can post those. But 3 budgeting mistakes you probably don't realize you're making. So just some pitfalls. First one, we've talked about this: failing to track your spending before you make your budget. So it all hinges on where your money goes now. That's how you start your budget. Um, Not leaving wiggle room. So being really aggressive with it and getting excited and just being like, all right, I'm going to put up this much towards this. I'm going to put that much in my wiggle room. And you have a budget that accounts for basically every single dollar. But maybe you've forgotten about an irregular expense. Maybe you pay your housing taxes your house tax once a year, or you have a bill that comes through once a year. I have an Audible account, and so my Audible bill comes once a year. So, I need to remember about those things, the irregular ones, to make sure I don't cut it too tight. Now, I did have questions in a previous seminar that someone asked, what if I've been furloughed or my hours have been reduced because of COVID and money's really tight? And it's hard. It's really hard. And I know that some of you might be in that situation where maybe a spouse or partner isn't working because of COVID. You should be aware of some COVID regulations that allow you to access money in a retirement plan if you have it without a penalty. So that is available. But really, I guess what I would just say is do what you can to stay above water, even if it means cutting out all of the discretionary spending. Do what you can to keep your head above water and just know that it won't continue forever. Eventually we're going to come to an end of this, and COVID will be something that, we might always be dealing with it, but maybe it'll be like the flu where it's there, but maybe it doesn't govern our everyday lives, and we can get back to regular interactions and regular spending. Right now, we are at a record level in savings accounts across the nation. And a lot of it is wealthy people that have a lot of money in savings. But I can tell you, as soon as the COVID restrictions are shut down, there's a lot of money that's going to be spent on things like travel and discretionary items. Everybody that I'm talking to right now who's doing retirement planning is telling me that they haven't been spending as much money over the last year because they're not doing the things they want to do. They're not traveling. Um, they're not going out with friends. They're not partying. And so, a lot of people have been saving more. And so as things improve, that money's going to funnel in. And that means employment rates should go right back up. Who knows? Maybe it will equate to wage growth and all sorts of good things. Generally that's good when we have that happening in the markets. Let me see here, get back to it. Okay, so that is the last slide for this seminar on budgeting. So I guess I'll open it up for questions, and maybe if you want to do hand raising, you can ask the questions verbally, or if you want to type them in, however you want to do it. I would just remind you that this session is being recorded, so you probably don't want to share personal information when you are asking questions. And also, just before we get to that, I'd like to also just tell everyone there's another one next week that talks about budgeting. I'm also starting a new series called Ask Fidelity Sessions. So keep an eye out for the Ask Fidelity Sessions. Those will be every 2 weeks during lunchtime on Wednesday, where we just talk about all different topics. It's just going to be a short 10-minute presentation followed by Q&A, and you can ask any questions you want in those. And then lastly, if you want to schedule an appointment with me to go over any of this, I'll be happy to build a budget with you, to go over with your budget, to talk about how to do it, how to do your financial planning, etc. You can schedule an appointment by going to fidelity.com/schedule. So actually fidelity.com/schedule or fidelity.com/reserve. Either one will do that. When you get into that tool, when you go to fidelity.com/reserve, you probably won't see anything on the first screen for reservations. That's because it's showing this week or next week, which, all the appointments are already taken. There's a little arrow you click on to load more days. So just keep clicking that until you see some days in there. You're welcome to email me directly. You can email me at doug.stuckey@fmr.com. So it's doug.stuckey. In fact, let me go.
Yeah, I also just threw in the chat the UW direct link too for anyone who wants to grab that. So then you'll see specifically all the Fidelity reps who work with UW too.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Anna.
I'm not seeing any hand raises or questions come through in the chat. We can give it a few more minutes. As Doug said, we'll be meeting again next week. All that information will be shared with you via email, but you can also find it on our group page. Let me send that in this chat as well. If you haven't had a chance to already check that out, that is where this recording will go up. All right, there's that link. Thank you so much, Doug. I mean, it's just a wonderful, I've sat in this seminar a few times. It's always great to learn more and get a refresher. And again, I'm not seeing any other questions come through. So I think we'll just close early today. And thanks for everyone who hopped on. We'll see most of you hopefully next week. And Doug and I will be here next week with you.
All right. Thanks so much. See ya.
Have a good